Hello and welcome to Scientists for Open Science, PLOS's ongoing campaign that brings researchers and stakeholders together from around the globe to share perspectives on open science and open research. My name is Dan Morgan, the Director of Communications and Community Relations here at PLOS. I'm joined today by Praveen Paul and Callam Davidson to have a conversation about taking science beyond the academy to the public. So I'd just love to ask you guys to briefly introduce yourselves, starting with you, Praveen.
Hi, thank you very much for having me. So I'm the co-founder of Pint of Science, which is a global science festival for the public. And I'm also the director of Pint of Science UK. And we run a science festival in 30 countries across the world. And I've lost count of number of cities, 500 cities, I think it is.
And I'm Callam Davidson. I'm an associate editor for PLOS Medicine just now, but I previously have been co-director along with Praveen of Pint of Science Festival and have put in lots of hours as a Pint of Science volunteer during my PhD research.
Fantastic. All right, well, the clue is in your introductions. I would love to hear more about Pint of Science. So could you tell me more about how it came about, your inspiration, successes, any surprises, and anything you want to tell me, really?
Yeah, so Pint of Science started way back in 2013. We're actually coming up to our 10th festival next year, which is pretty amazing. But my background is neuroscience, and I was a postdoc, and I used to work at Imperial College London, where I met Michael Motzkin, who's the co-founder of Pint of Science. And he and I were working in a lab, and we realized that we spend all our day looking down microscopes, and we never actually meet people that are affected by the conditions that we're working on. He was working on Parkinson's, I was working on ALS, or motor neuron disease. And it started by inviting people affected by those conditions into the lab to see what we do and for us to get to know them. And we'd never had any experience of running events or sort of talking to people beyond kind of our science world. And we thought it would be a bit of fun and something cool to do. We struggled a little bit to get it off the ground, but we managed to do it, and it's quite successful. We had 100 people come over visit us, and for us as scientists, it was just completely eye-opening to meet these people, and for the people to come and visit us was also great, because I myself used to get funded by research, and I think it's important for people to know if they've donated to, sorry, I'd be funded by a charity, if they donated to a charity, where that money goes to. And so from that, we thought it'd be good if people are interested to come and see us in our actual labs, then maybe we will take it out to where people are. And so we came up with the idea of taking it to pubs, which is not a new idea, because things like Cafe Scientific have been around for only 3 decades now, since the 90s, and there are lots of things. But what made Pint of Science slightly different is that we were going to run everything at the same time. So instead of kind of a monthly talk, it all happens at the same time. You choose which subject you're interested in, and then kind of go to that venue or that stage. And we run it in a few cities. So we decided the idea would be like a one-off thing. We didn't intend to start a science festival. We just thought, we were coming towards the end of our postdocs, we were slightly bored. Michael was doing a cell development course, and he thought it'd fit quite nicely into that. And we had no experience of like running events, doing anything, talking to people beyond beyond the lab. So we were completely naive doing this. And I kind of want to stress that, because we didn't come from a place of like, we are science communicators, we're really interested in people need to know this. It's more like, you know what, I don't actually know what you do. And people, when we talk to our friends, they're like, what the hell do you do? We don't know. And so we gathered a few friends together back in 2013 and said, find a venue and find some speakers. And it's very kind of shabbily put together. In our first year, we kind of had London, Cambridge and Oxford involved as our 3 cities, and we managed to run 45 events. Fast forward to just pre-pandemic, we've now reached over 50 cities in the UK. And as I mentioned, 500 cities across the world, 30 countries. And the idea just kind of exploded. And for us, we were just like really surprised that people are interested to come and see and interested in the subjects. That scientists get so much out of kind of sharing their work as well. And the organisers, who are mainly scientist-based at universities, also get so much out of so many skills from organising multiple events on kind of a large scale. So the event happens annually in the month of May over 3 days, and all the countries are running events at the same time.
Fantastic. Callam, and what would you add to that? Well,
I suppose what I can add is I wasn't there at the inception of Pint of Science. I came on as a volunteer in 2015-16, so I can sort of speak to what it's like to come into it from the outside. I think one of the things Pint of Science has done really successfully is kind of, by running it for those 3 days a year and creating kind of a festival buzz around it. Like Praveen says, like scientists speaking in pubs maybe isn't new, but yeah, that thing of creating that exciting buzz meant that Pint of Science got like huge amounts of media coverage. So I remember I was on a train up to Edinburgh where I did my PhD, and I was reading BBC News, and I saw that there was this Pint of Science festival, and it just sounded really, really fun. There's some great like sort of the branding around the festival with Barney, the little pint glass logo and things. All of that sort of caught my eye, and I thought I could probably do that. And I assumed it would already be in Edinburgh, because Edinburgh is like the festival city, but it wasn't. So I sent a kind of slightly cocky email probably to Praveen being like, I could probably do that for you. And then to my horror, she said, yes, you can. So I was like, oh my God, I have to do it now. Yeah, and from there, it was just like super, I suppose empowering is the word really, like to be an organizer. There's a lot of creative control given to volunteers running Pint of Science in their own city. It's very much like a we'll support you in making the festival you want to make, as opposed to you're making a festival for us. So yeah, you pretty much just gather together a bunch of friends and yeah, curate your own science festival, which then there's obviously a huge amount of reach for because of the audience that Pint of Science now has. So yeah, it's a pretty excellent example of something that began as a kind of grassroots community-led thing and has just, you know, taken over the
very
world.
Much grassroots. We never intended it to become a thing or a festival, and the first few years was a complete struggle. It's always a struggle sometimes, but Pint of Science is very much a platform for kind of scientists to kind of showcase their work, talk about their work, for people to find out about the range of research that goes on. Because like even, you know, working in university, you don't know what someone's doing in the bench next to you, or let alone the department next to you. And you're like, wow, like sometimes like, wow, someone actually gets paid to do that research. Like why are they doing that research, and to kind of understand why they're doing that. But also to give scientists the confidence to talk to a wider audience as well, and to develop those skills. And it's really interesting for, as Callam said, it's like freedom is given to the organisers to do. If you want someone to do a rap in the middle of your Pint of Science events, go for it. If you want to do some dancing, it's completely up to you. We'll just provide the platform, and everyone else is going to come up with much better ideas than I will. And this is the beauty of Pint of Science. People just come up with so many amazing ideas and ways to, you know, present or showcase the science and the research. And I think for me, it's been quite inspirational to see the growth of people as they're organising it, or as they're kind of giving talks and just chatting to the audience as well. When you go to the events, it's really good.
Yeah, I mean, this is fantastic. I mean, I can certainly tell you from my vantage point in the San Francisco Bay Area, where I was around 2015, when I kind of first went to something labeled as a Pint of Science event, and so which I now, you know, in hindsight, presume, feel like it wasn't around May time in Berkeley. And so, you know, I just presume this was like seasoned science communicators running kind of this global network of, you know, very kind of glossy events. You know, I didn't know it was kind of such a grassroots kind of, you know, let's just try this kind of thing. It's wonderful to hear.
When Michael and I started, we didn't even know there was like a whole field of science communication. We really felt like we were almost outsiders, and then just trying to work it out. In some ways, that was good because we were so naive in what we were doing. We were just kind of working out as we went along. Because I think, had we listened to the people who had done those things before, we might have been a bit reluctant to kind of take it a step further. And so we kind of carved our own way of doing it. Yeah, and it just snowballed really. Yeah.
Do you find now that, that the people, the science communicators now come to you as seasoned science communicators to say, well, we're on the outside, we need to know from the experts?
Occasionally that does happen. It's like, how do you do that? Or sort of talking to, it's interesting because we always thought we were either like not, because we weren't kind of in that kind of niche area. We thought we were doing like things wrong, we didn't know what we were doing. But then having since been involved in or kind of spoken to other science festivals, I mean, everyone's got their own kind of different challenges and different aims and aspirations. But, you know, there's some things that we do really well where we can kind of help them out and say, this is what you need to do. Or this would kind of help. And we can quite clearly, clearly see where things we tweak. And equally, we can pick up from other festivals where they're focusing on different directions, like, oh, that might be interesting to do. And we've added things in as the festival's gone on. So in the UK, Creative Reaction is quite a large branch where we pair the scientists with artists, and then the artists create a piece of artwork based on the research of their understanding. and then it's put on a kind of a large gallery in quite a few cities around the UK. Yeah, and that opens up to new audiences of families and things. Most of our audience are usually adults, and that kind of brings a completely different aspect of it. Rather than someone talking about their research, you're engaging by like, okay, this is a painting. You don't see it here, but I've got about 3 creative reaction pictures behind me as well, which has been great to see.
Callam, sorry, I cut you off earlier.
No, I was just going to say it's kind of on the previous point about I think people sometimes come to Pint of Science, for example, when we like collaborate with other organizations. I think, like you said, it seems from certainly as an audience member, I think you would assume it's got some kind of big HQ offices somewhere or something like that. It's quite funny when people used to like, phone us on Zoom for collaborative calls, and you'd be like, oh no, it's just a couple of us on laptops. But
yeah, you're like, okay, get phone calls. Can you like put this through to your finance department? It's like, oh, that's me. Can you put this through your web person? Oh, that's me. You are kind of doing every kind of aspect of it. Yeah.
Well, I mean, but and as you were saying, Callam, that in addition to going to events in Berkeley, like 2 years after you started, I do remember reading about it, and I do remember it being kind of, just even the name Pint of Science, I think, was kind of super catchy, and people kind of latched onto it. So it always seemed like bigger and kind of more established than I think it was. Of course, now it is much more established, but at that time, yeah, I do distinctly remember thinking it was just this established science communication center in the United Kingdom or something. Well, I mean, obviously wearing your hats now as seasoned science communicators and experts, like what are the common misconceptions or misperceptions or pitfalls in communicating science to the public? Because the theme of this today, during this week, is kind of impact and kind of having an impact like outside of the academy. So yeah, just interested in kind of what have been your key learnings and things to celebrate and things to look out for.
Yeah, I think one of the challenges is always trying to train the speakers into pitching at the correct level. So this is always difficult to get, and then some of this does depend a little bit on the audience as well, whether you don't want kind of too many kind of jargon or abbreviations and talk, or to being it too scientific. It's got to be approachable. You never give a brief, so approachable for people who might don't have a background in science, left science at 16, but not to oversimplify it. So sometimes trying to get that balance is tricky. And actually, when Callam was involved, he made this great video, which has not gone public yet, but of kind of to help, which was kind of an animated video of how to approach the subject and how to present to a wider audience and public audience. So that's quite tricky to do, I think. I don't think you're going to get it right, and some people are naturally better at it than others. But also, I think the charm of Pint of Science is you're having a bit slightly quirky. Like, we don't want it to be too polished. We want people to see scientists as humans. They've got personalities. They've got different styles of presenting. There's no kind of one correct way of doing things. So that's, I think, also is quite important to make scientists approachable as well.
I would sort of add that I think as far as misconceptions around science communication generally go, I think the idea of there being a kind of general public audience is a bit of a misconception. Like the idea that you can view all non-scientists as wanting the same kind of content. It's really easy to fall into the trap of thinking like you can just make one kind of sciencey event and plonk it in a place and you'll attract like a hugely diverse audience of different people who'll all come along because just because of the merit of how well it's been advertised or whatever. But actually there's like quite a lot of complexity to the question of like getting people into your events who aren't already maybe quite sort of scientifically literate. So if scientists are interested in science, right? Like, so I think a lot of public engagement events struggle to bring in an audience that's maybe comprised more of people who have never thought about themselves as like being a sciencey person. You hear that a lot when you talk about science to people who aren't scientists. Like people very quickly will say like, oh no, that wasn't for me at school or whatever. I can't do science. And obviously the aim of any science communication organization is to bring more of those kind of people in and show them that it's not like that. Actually, and I think that's kind of an important, central premise of science communication should be that we're kind of building trust in science and conveying to people that it's not something that professes to have all the answers. It's something that's like a process for approaching the world, and thinking about problems and arriving at an evidence-based conclusion. So yeah, a lot of the stuff that took up my thinking when I was sort of doing Pint of Science full time was just how you make science communication events that maximize engagement, not just not just thinking about audience size, but thinking about composition of the audience. So yeah, that's a really complicated part of it.
I think a lot of assuming that you know what the audience want, saying, oh yeah, we're scientists, we know what you want, you got to hear this, and that's it, and then just kind of deliver it and goodbye. It's kind of it's a lot more to it than that. And as Callam said, it's not as simple. And getting ideas from the audience is a good way to kind of start. And as I said, doing things like creative reactions, trying to take it in a different way as well. It's going to help them.
I mean, I was interested in what you said, Praveen, that, this started off when you and your colleague were actually researching kind of problems in diseases and things. And so is one of the modes that you've got to be careful of is when the public is potentially people affected by, diseases that you may be studying, and whether they're just like an interested party. Is that kind of a line? Is it different when you're speaking to, let's say, patients rather than just the public?
I don't think it should be if you're giving a presentation about it. I think you should be kind of considerate of those audience members. Sometimes, like I said, if you're working on a certain disease and you've never met people with a disease, I think that is an issue because you might not be aware of how to handle things sensitively. I think that's part of it as well. But at the same time, with Pint of Science, we don't want to hide anything. We're going to cover everything up and just kind of say, this is where research is at. This is why we can't get to X. Some of it gets political. It's not to do with science. It can be down to funding and things like that. And just making people more aware of that. Because I certainly remember when we had our kind of Meet the Scientists event, a lot of the people who came to visit our labs being surprised that we don't have full-time permanent positions, and a lot of us may leave to go and do banking or something else, and not realizing that you don't get it's not a continuous source of funding. And I think people were surprised to learn some of that.
One of the nicest things I used to find with Pint of Science talks was that you just touched on it briefly there, Praveen, about being open about the whole process of being a scientist. I used to like that. Obviously, when you're publishing a paper, as the end stage product of your research, there's a lot of pressure. Hopefully, with the move towards open science, increasingly less pressure. But obviously, there's pressure to present a very polished finished product that maybe doesn't have time or space to go into the various things along the way that went wrong or didn't work first time or were an absolute nightmare to refine. And I think that Pint of Science, it was always nice to see that speakers, because you had that more casual, informal forum, in a pub, just chatting to people, you would see people commit big parts of their talks maybe to something that didn't work or something that they struggled with, or were banging their heads against the walls trying to I think that's a huge part of giving a more realistic insight into science, is showcasing that stuff doesn't work half the time and it's an ongoing battle to try and make things work. More than half the time. Most of the time. So that's that's a nice aspect of I suppose informal science conversations rather than the manuscript product that has to have more.
No, and that's a perfect segue, because I was going to ask kind of around some questions around whether kind of the movements towards more transparency and open science in science in general was kind of related to, helpful for, or just separate to the kind of the public communication science. But then actually, I would also add to that, what you were saying, Callam, really meta science and the understanding of how science is done more transparently, presumably is affected by this. But what are your thoughts about how open science and the move to transparency is kind of symbiotic relationship with the public communication of science?
I definitely think it's helping a lot, because I think as scientists, your research is being read by a lot more people, and also as well as the public, but people that are in different fields as well. So I think you're kind of more aware of how, because I think previously you kind of focus on one area, and kind of people within your area will read what you've researched and what you've found. And this now brings it up to a more open, so more people find out about it. And what I also find which is quite nice in some of the events you do is you get kind of cross collaborations where you might get a physicist seeing like a talk on biology or something based in biology and think, actually, I've done something, or I've kind of found something, or worked on something which can be applied to that biological problem, or vice versa. And I think those things wouldn't happen unless we are more aware of what people are actually doing and how it kind of applies to different things.
I feel as though there's something interesting as well in like it's sort of not really a thing that Pint of Science obviously does at this stage, but it's an interesting thought to think of, like, you know, the conversation around open science generally and the shift towards more open practices is something that I think within scientific circles is a really hot topic for debate and people have a lot of thoughts on. But I imagine a lot of people who are outside of science don't even realize it's a shifting kind of dynamic within the industry. You know, for people who've worked in science, we understand that, you know, publishing once upon a time was very much you kind of have to send your papers in, and then it's an almost sort of gatekeeping process. And there was obviously a lot of profits being made by publishers at the inception of the industry. And now we're moving towards a kind of much more collaborative industry, hopefully, where editors and journals are working with scientists to kind of be allies in helping them get their science out there. But I feel as though that would actually be fascinating to people who don't work in science as well, and again provide more kind of trust in the process of science by kind of communicating that to people. So I don't know if maybe there's like the potential somewhere down the line for a, you know, strand of talks around how, you know, science is actually done. Kind of touching on what I said before, really. I feel as though half the interest is the findings and half the interest is what it means to practice science. So yeah, I don't know, maybe somewhere in the future there's a whole event strand around that to be done. But
yeah, well, I think, you know, with the kind of that coupled with certain specific open science practices like the rise in preprinting, you know, I think could be super important, because, you know, it's funny how people can, you know, preprint is a preprint, right? It does what it does, but you can have two completely separate angle viewpoints on it. Like some people, you know, it's a non-peer-reviewed item, and some people are like, oh, that's bad because it's out there and it's not peer-reviewed. And then there's the other people that say, well, that's great, it's not peer-reviewed, therefore it can be peer-reviewed, you know, in advance and early and very democratically. So it's, you know, it's to me, it's going to be really super important for kind of, you know, science communicators to be very clear about, no, this is a good thing that it gets out there early, but it's a good thing because it's out there for review, not for digestion as the absolute final truth on the matter. Is preprint discussions come up kind of in your kind of activities at Pint?
I think preprints are definitely important because, like I said, it's rather than just kind of two reviews, kind of just reading your thing, you're getting a lot of input from different directions. And I'm still surprised. I still get emails asking me to review papers, and I left academic science like 10 years ago, and I'm still like, I've left this. I was like, why am I being asked to review a paper? I probably wouldn't, you know, I've been out of the field for so long. So those things can be dangerous. So yeah, I think, yeah, preprints definitely make it a lot more open as well, and approaching it from different angles. Yeah.
I imagine, Praveen, you'll have had quite a lot of like talks this year, given that COVID, as I understand it, has sort of amplified the amount of preprints being picked up by the press and things. There's probably been quite a lot of talks that are based on, you know, based on stuff that hasn't necessarily been peer reviewed or published yet because it's so fast moving. So yeah, I suppose that, I don't know, it plays into that whole...
Talking about, public engagement as well, because there's things that you have to be careful of, that people just pick up the title if they don't necessarily understand what they're reading. And if everything is open, I can kind of, I've had friends who've said, you know, I've done all this research on this, and they've had no background in science, like, you know, I found X, Y, and Z, and this is because of this. And it's just them firmly believing it because they've kind of found these things on the internet. Whether or not it's peer reviewed, trying to get that balance right, isn't it?
Yeah. No, there's very little, I guess, one can do about, a citizen scientist or just a general public person like going out there and finding stuff. But certainly, I think, organizations, such as Pint of Science or, kind of media organizations kind of learning how to guide the media in reacting to preprints is going to be hugely useful. And that, yes, note them, but, kind of you might have to change how you report on them to how you report on fully, final published journal articles and stuff. But I think that is happening. It's just things will always creep out, and combined with open data and open materials, and like if preprints are as open as hopefully final published journal articles are, I guess that it will all help and move things in the right direction. What are some of the most important things that organizations and communities like Pint of Science can help with or achieve as regarding increased trust in science? I mean, obviously the pandemic has been like a global event in so many ways, but it's kind of all been a global scientific event as well. How do communities like yours help in like increasing the trust in science?
Yeah, so because all our speakers are actual researchers and scientists, it's quite nice for people to actually hear from people doing the work rather than maybe through the media or someone else who's going to repackage it in a slightly different way. So actually meeting the scientists themselves is important. And the pandemic has been interesting because it's really changed. I think obviously scientists are getting noticed, but I think people are realizing that everything's not so black and white. Like science doesn't have all the answers. There's a lot of gray. And the pandemic has really highlighted that because, you'll find a scientist who will believe, you do wear face masks. You find scientists who like evidence, no, you shouldn't. And I think that has been great for the people to kind of understand that there's more to science than what, they usually think science has all the answers, but it doesn't. And some of it gets politicized. And certainly with Pint of Science, you've seen, it's quite interesting to see how different countries have experienced the pandemic. In some of the countries where they've had, great chief medical officers or something, suddenly the whole country, they want to become scientists. The kids are like really excited about science, want to do it. In other countries where it's not been handled so well, that the scientists are seen as like they don't know what they're doing, or and that's been quite interesting for me to see in other countries how the pandemic has been perceived and how scientists are then being perceived as well. Yeah.
I also think with Pint of Science, the audience is being given the chance to sort of question scientists directly is it's kind of helpful in a two-way direction. It's sort of both helpful for audiences to have the chance to speak directly to scientists, like Praveen says, but also that's quite beneficial as a scientist. I remember so many speakers saying to me after events that a member of the non-scientific community asking them a question that was really left field, that someone who's like extremely deep down the rabbit hole of neuroscience will always spot the same kinds of issues perhaps, and they'll be very technical issues and very important for the research, but maybe you kind of come prepared as a scientist for those kind of criticisms, whereas it only takes like an 8-year-old saying, but why is this like this or something? Yeah,
and you just cool happens.
Yeah, and it kind of blows your mind because you're like, whoa, I never even thought about it from that angle. It doesn't necessarily change your entire funding proposal, but it just gives you that new kind of refreshing insight on your own work, because science, it's very easy to go so deep that you almost lose sight of what is the exciting bit for the average person.
No, I mean, I agree that what you were saying, Praveen, like the different, you almost like you can see the different roles that you might make Pint of Science like play in certain countries. Like I think in a country like the UK, where it's small geographically, and you get this kind of pub atmosphere, that might be quite different to say where I live, which is rural California, where sure a scientist has never walked into some of the bars around here, and I think if they did, they would, it would be a very confusing situation. And I just think
it's a joke, isn't it? A scientist walks into
yeah, in rural California. So no, I mean it's huge. I think each country, each region has kind of its probably its hot button topics that would be good to kind of get just a smidge more knowledge out there about process. I think the US has been kind of very polarized in its kind of acceptance of scientific kind of research during the pandemic, and even just a casual conversation like I had with somebody in fact in a bar, where they were kind of railing against just like how many predictions had been wrong, like in the early part of the pandemic last year as regards spread and things like that. And I remember I'd just seen one of those articles about the modeling of it, where no one had accounted for people not doing what they were told in some of the spread modeling, right? And when I just kind of brought up that anecdote to them, which is, I'm not a scientist, I'm a work for a publisher, and but just they'd never thought of it in that way. And even this person who was kind of pretty anti-science, pretty Republican, kind of learned something that they'd never really conceived about how modeling works, and that you also have to build in kind of what people do and the variability of that. So like I said, I just swear that I just think any increase in understanding of the scientific process in any public setting is like just wonderful, even in settings where you don't think it'll have a big impact, but that's why I just love hearing about kind of these kinds of impacts and the activities that go on in Pint of Science.
Yeah, you never know what impact kind of what you're doing anyway. Like kind of what we do, it's you kind of do it. You don't know what kind of nugget the member of the audience might have taken away from the event, or the speaker themselves kind of, as Callam said, they suddenly think about their work in a completely different way and they get new ideas.
Yeah. So I've been kind of asking everybody I've been speaking to during this week, kind of in these interviews, kind of about feeling hopeful, feeling positive. Obviously, we all have our personal missions and kind of what we're doing. And I've asked people that are dealing very specifically in reproducibility, like, are you hopeful things are getting better? And if I could therefore ask you, Praveen and Callam, kind of on the topic of good communication of science to the public, reducing miscommunications, et cetera, are things getting better? And are you more hopeful, or are you seeing kind of more challenges the further down the road you get?
More hopeful, of course, surely. Yeah, no, it's increasing, and I think as scientists, scientists are more aware of kind of bringing things to the public, and it's interesting how they're kind of then kind of make you think. I had something the other day, we were trying to organise an event, ask a scientist, can you send me a little blurb about what you're going to be talking about? It's got like a 1,000-word abstract, if you can call it an abstract. It's like, hang on, it's kind of rethinking kind of what you're doing as a scientist, kind of why you're doing it, and maybe simplifying it so that non-scientists can understand. I think is a really important part of it. And I think sometimes as scientists you do get kind of stuck in a rut of you're going to scientific conferences and things and presenting things very technically, and kind of then think actually your audience is X, Y, and Z. They're this age, this is their background, adjusting it. And obviously they're not going to know how to do that straight away, but I think with experience and having platforms where they can experiment with, changing how they present their work and getting the feedback from the audience of what they get and what they don't get, will, eventually that'll kind of creep in, and hopefully it'll be a normal part of being a scientist, is just, how to kind of switch between talking to an academic audience versus a non-academic audience.
I think that I too would class myself as optimistic, and I think that the shift towards kind of conversation being more around equity is a really important part of that. I think there being more of an appreciation of, so it's like things are getting better, like Praveen says, people are more aware of the importance of science communication, especially in what's been an era of a lot of mistrust in expertise and misinformation and whatnot. But at the same time, the kind of, like we kind of began with, really the complexity of making sure you're actually getting the science to the people who maybe are less likely to normally find themselves at a science event. That's the more complicated part that I am optimistic about, but I think it's where people should be sort of channeling their energies, thinking about how you engage, like you were just saying then, Dan, like, if you've got a rural community that's nowhere near a university and isn't often going to get science events, how do you make sure, if you just went and organized an event there, are you going to get a big demographic of people who wouldn't normally go to those kind of events going there just because you put it there? Or do you need to come up with more nuanced ways of involving communities like that in the curation of these events? That's why I think it's kind of important for organizations like ours, I guess, organizations that are very firmly rooted in science should be reaching out to other organizations that have like lived experience of the kinds of completely different backgrounds that we can't necessarily speak to, and working together such that it's not just scientists making events and saying, come along, look, we want to talk to you. It's about scientists saying, what do you actually want to know more about? Or what would you like to see? What would appeal particularly to you know, the community that you're part of. So yeah, optimistic, but lots of work to be done.
Yeah, I going back to what you both said, I love the idea of this, you know, in the same way, like open science itself, like, which has in the past seemed like an administrative burden or an extra obstacle to hit, kind of like baking the notion of, you know, dealing with the publics, you know, into being a scientist more, rather than it being this kind of add-on or an extra project or something like that, kind of including in the kind of like research and researcher culture more, you know, just more on a more basic and just absolutely understood level. I hope we're on a kind of curve to that, and I look forward to seeing that happen. Well, I think, thank you so much for your time. I mean, like all of these conversations, we could probably have day-long and conference-long kind of conversations about all these topics, but let's just end it there, and I'll thank you so much again for your time. Thank you to all the watchers for watching, and anything that we've mentioned that kind of is served for extra information with a link, please look in the notes of the video, and I'll kind of drop any links in there that we've referred to, or any interesting additional reading that the three of us come up with. But yeah, Callam, Praveen, thank you so much for your time.
Thanks very much, Sam.